The Blackmagic Pocket 4K, 6K, 6K Pro, 6K Cinema Camera full frame, Ursa Mini 12K, Pyxis, Panasonic S5, S5 IIX, Sony Fx3, Sony A7 IV, Canon C70, Canon C80, Fx6, and the red Komodo. What do all these cameras have in common? I have owned, or have used all of these cameras extensively, and I'm here to tell you which one is best for you. They all have their strengths and weaknesses. They suit different workflows, and I'm going to break down the pros and cons of each, and I'm even going to pick an overall best camera, the king of all these cameras, in the ultimate guide, and then I'm never ever doing another gear review, ever again, until next week. If you don't have a sense of humor and you have the attention span of Jar Jar Binks, then skip to otherwise. Now, let's just preface this conversation by saying this is my personal opinion. And if you have any of these cameras, congratulations. You have an amazing camera capable of shooting amazing footage that is light years ahead of what you could film with a similar camera even 5 years ago. We're spoiled for choice, and we're spoiled by the quality that these cameras are able to produce. These comparisons are based on my experiences filming with them, and sometimes we're really splitting hairs and talking about very minor differences. You should never feel compelled to upgrade your camera if your camera is working for you. But this is YouTube after all, and isn't that what we're all here to do? Let's start with the Blackmagic cameras. I started this channel really talking about filming with and breaking down the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro, but I also own its predecessor, the Blackmagic Pocket 4K. And while I did do a video discussing my Pocket 6K Pro breaking on a shoot and saying goodbye to this camera, I never actually said goodbye to this camera. In fact, I use the Pocket 6K cameras the most of all my cameras, primarily in a studio setup, but also for documentary and corporate shoots. Blackmagic really cracked the code with the Pocket 6K, and if we're talking about value for money, if we're talking about creating a cinematic image, the Pocket 6Ks just cannot be beaten. B-RAW is so easy to work with and gives you a lot more ability to push and pull color than Sony's S-Log3 or Panasonic's V-Log. In fact, it's better than everything except Red RAW for its flexibility in post-production. Also, there is something quite sublime about the new Gen 5 color science that Blackmagic have delivered that provides a more filmic, less digital look than basically almost all the other cameras I'm covering here. Once again, with the exception of the red. They also have pretty good preamps to run audio into, and the back touchscreen is incredibly handy to use, plus dual native ISO for low light. If I was a new filmmaker who wanted to make narrative films, I think if it's a cinema look you're after, then you can't beat a Pocket 6K Pro or the new 6K Cinema Camera full frame. Now, does the Pocket 4K still have a place after the release of the newer 6Ks? In most cases, I would say the 6K provides something a little better. Better screen that's tiltable and brighter, better dynamic range, better in low light, better batteries, and the EF mount is more useful to pair with lenses than the Pocket 4K's Micro Four Thirds mount, which you're going to want to get an adapter for anyway to make the most of this camera. The only instance where I would say buy the Pocket 4K over a 6K is if you want to save money on storage, as you save a lot of hard drive space filming in 4K instead of 6K. So what are the downsides to these cameras? Well, Blackmagic cameras firstly don't have the luxury of autofocus, something that really no true cinema cameras have, but something we as consumers have become spoilt with through Canon and Sony's lineup. This lack of autofocus is not unsimilar to driving a car. If you learn to drive a manual car, it's something you acclimatize to quickly and never really think about. If you learn to drive an automatic car and then switch to manual, it's going to be a steep learning curve and you're going to feel very out of your element.
Forget it, Donnie, you're out of your element.
The same is true when learning to operate a camera. Personally, I think as you move from amateur to professional, you must not only acknowledge but accept that cinema cameras and cinema lenses are going to be manual focus most of the time. And the sooner you begin to learn and master this art, the more of the top-end cameras and lenses will become available to you. You can watch my top tips for nailing manual focus here. But it should be acknowledged that when filming corporate videos and quick run-and-gun shoots and documentaries, having the ability to sit back and let the camera worry about focusing can be a very handy tool that will make your life much easier in many filming environments. Then we have the dreaded battery life of the pocket cameras, which are going to give you 30 to 50 minutes depending on your use case, which means that for professional shoots, you'll need to look at a rigging solution with additional batteries if you don't want to be swapping out and stopping your shoots frequently. This leads to the next problem with these cameras, and that's their form factor. While the back touchscreen is a gift, it's also a curse, as having a 5-inch monitor on the back leads to the cameras having a very awkward DSLR shape, which gets more awkward when using longer lenses. When you start adding V-mount batteries, rails, and cages, this awkward shape does feel frustrating, and it's why we have all been calling out for a more box-style version of this camera. And then Blackmagic announced the Pyxis, which, yes, is a box-style camera, but isn't really a new camera. It's exactly the same as the 6K full frame, just in a box. And maybe this box is not a very well-designed box that's missing a few key features like a monitor in the right place, full-size XLR ports, and a proper V-mount battery plate. What's crazy about the Pyxis is that all they had to do was keep their basic Ursa Mini design, but make it half the size of the Ursa and slightly more cube-shaped. That was it. But instead they tried a little too hard to be innovative and reinvent the wheel. For my money, I would save my money and stick with a 6K cinema camera full frame, which will give you exactly the same image quality, cost significantly less, and need less accessories to start filming with. But ultimately, if image is all that you care about and getting the best image for the lowest amount of expenditure, then a Pyxis or a cinema camera 6K full frame still in 2024 stands above most of its competitors. And I'm talking about cameras double its price like the Canon C70 and Fx6. And this is why I chose to use 6K cameras in the most recent documentary series I've been working on. If you can deal with its awkward form factor, then hail to the king, baby. So why move up to the Ursa Mini Pro G2 or Ursa Mini 12K? Well, one of the biggest reasons will be its more professional body, which has full-size XLR ports, timecode, SDI in and out, and the ability to mount larger V-mount batteries straight onto its body, and a whole heap of extra shooting modes and options. Now that these cameras are priced the same, buying the Ursa 12K is a no-brainer, and it's important not to get focused on the 12K resolution, as this is just one of its features, and one that you don't even have to use. You can film in 8K or 4K using the sensor's full frame and downsample, giving you an incredibly clean image and save on data rates. Also, shooting B-RAW's more compressed options like 12 or even 18:1 still gives you incredible image quality that's slightly softer, but that's a good thing as you get very pleasing, less digital look by using these options. I had the pleasure of testing the Ursa 12K recently and I was absolutely blown away by the image quality. It might be the most underrated camera on the market. I made a video about that as well. And if you like filming in slow motion, the 120 frames per second and 8K or 4K is absolutely insane quality. Also, the Gen 5 color science in the 12K seems to be tweaked to offer Blackmagic's best quality image to date, while the Ursa G2 still can't provide Gen 5 in-camera, and converting it in post doesn't feel the same. It's hard to say why the 12K image is so good, but there's just something about the highlight roll-off, the way it handles skin tones, and the digital noise feeling much more like film grain than previous versions. It certainly feels like Blackmagic were going for an ARRI style image, and if you're looking for a poor man's ARRI, they can give you a huge amount of flexibility in codecs and shooting options and the best 120 frames per second in the market, then the 12K once again offers what might be the best bang for the buck in that 5 to 6K range of cameras. In fact, I almost bought one for my new documentary series. Now, with the new upcoming Blackmagic cameras like the new 12K or 17K on the horizon, and the price drops and specials on the original 12K, there's never been a better time to consider this camera, which has been criminally overlooked and underrated since its release. Now, the downside to the Ursa is not dissimilar to the Pocket 6Ks, as while the cinema body is not a bad shape, it is heavy, and in recent years, smaller, more modular bodies have become more mainstream, meaning that this big boy feels a little outdated in 2024. But once again, if image quality is your primary focus, I think this produces something better looking than my red Komodo and certainly provides far better frame rate options. Next we have the Sony's Fx3, and we can also add in the Sony A7S III and the Sony ZV-E1, which is almost the same apart from a few features like the top handle and Cine EI. You could also make the argument that the Fx6 using the same sensor delivers pretty much the same image as these two, albeit with a fatter codec. Now, I'm going to say this right off the bat. The Sony Fx3 is overrated. I will also say the Sony Fx3 is not a cinema camera. Too many YouTubers have been paid to sing its praises while ignoring its shortcomings. Now, don't get me wrong, it is a great camera. In fact, of all the cameras you could own, it might be the most versatile. You can do 120 frames per second slow motion with almost no crop. You get a top handle with full-size XLRs and a preamp. You get great autofocus. You get full frame sensor with almost no rolling shutter. And you get, hands down, the best low-light camera on the market today. So if you need to film in the dark, there is nothing that really comes close. If you need something that can do everything, then look no further. The problem is, while the Fx3 can do everything, I don't think it does anything the best. So why don't I like the Fx3, and why did I ultimately sell mine? Firstly, the price. This is an overpriced camera, at least here in New Zealand. It's priced like a cinema camera that it claims to be, but it produces a very digital image, which I've always thought looked very DSLR-like. It's not what I'd call a cinematic look. S-Log3 and the Sony color science has improved immensely, but it's still not as good as Canon or Red or Blackmagic or Panasonic. I mean, I particularly find skin tones always skew very orange straight out of camera, and it always takes more work to get it looking organic and natural. It doesn't have any type of internal RAW. Yes, you can shoot ProRes RAW if you buy a Ninja 5, but this is an add-on, and ProRes RAW, in my opinion, is still quite a lot less flexible than Red RAW or even B RAW and Canon RAW. Now, Sony just feels way behind the 8 ball here if you like being able to push and pull your colors in post. S-Log3 is the least flexible log codec I've worked with. And Cine EI is a joke. I'm sorry, but this idea of having fixed ISO values to give you the most dynamic range is a total pain in the ass and incredibly limiting. I've also yet to see any real proof that you get a noticeable improvement in dynamic range using Cine EI. It just makes the camera more awkward to use. I mean, to me, it's like the biggest marketing gimmick of all time that provides no discernible advantage. I shot Cine EI with the Fx3. I shot in the 2 base ISO levels with my A7S III. I didn't see a difference. The Sony menu system is a convoluted, overly complicated time suck full of weird quirks and strange settings that take ridiculous amounts of time to navigate just to change basic things. I mean, the whole menu system needs a real overhaul when you see how much better Blackmagic and Red cameras do this. The camera was waiting on a 180-degree shutter option for literally years, which would be the first thing any real cinema camera would have. I mean, how hard is this for Sony to figure out? It's totally baffling. Then we actually have the form factor of this camera. Yes, it's nice that it's small in certain situations, but actually that can often work against it when you want it to feel like a cinema camera. But the biggest problem is probably the top handle, which is the least ergonomic, most poorly designed top handle ever seen on a camera. It creates an imbalance in the camera whenever it's added. There's no easy way to mount a monitor to it that makes sense. The handle itself is too small, and the microphone holder can't hold any normal sized microphone without adding a spacer to it. I mean, it's like someone at Sony designed it and never ever bothered to test whether its shape made any sense in a practical setup. I found the top handle so annoying and so bad for having a balance rigged, for a while I replaced it with the K3M adapter module. The camera is far from perfect and not particularly user-friendly. The image is definitely a step down from something like the Blackmagic 6K full frame, and to me its popularity has been solely based on YouTubers who shoot YouTube videos exclusively and want something that can do everything with the least amount of effort and craft. This might be the best all-round camera. It's certainly the perfect camera for corporate work, for which I use it for all the time. But it's not a cinema camera, and I don't think it's going to give you the best image if you're chasing the film look. But as a versatile workhorse or a low-light monster, the Fx3 is in a league of its own. But the dark horse for Sony, in my opinion, is actually the A7 IV. And as a cheaper alternative to the Fx3, it actually ticks a lot of boxes. It has better autofocus, and I think I actually prefer the image coming out of it with its colors skewing more green and less orange, which I prefer for skin tones. It is downsampling a 7K sensor, while the Fx3 is only a 4-point-something sensor. Downsampling from 7K provides the ability to crop in on your image to Super 35 mode. This lets you use Super 35 lenses, which are cheaper and also punch in on any shot by 1.5 times with no perceptible loss in quality. You essentially have your full frame focal length and your 1.5 times focal length, which means you can squeeze much more focal range out of each of your lenses as you film. I also find it quicker to switch between presets using the top dial on the A7 IV than going through the quick menu on the Fx3. Also, some reviewers have claimed that the A7 IV may actually have slightly more dynamic range than the Fx3. Now, it must be said that the A7 IV image is very sharp, incredibly crisp, and you'll either love that or find it to be a little too much. But for me, I enjoy filming on my A7 IV more than either the Fx3 or A7S III. It's also a much better photo camera than the other Sonys with a 33 megapixel sensor instead of 18 megapixels. So if you take a lot of stills and also shoot video, the A7 IV will suit your needs much better. But the A7 IV is a cheaper camera and it does have some drawbacks. While it is good in low light, it's definitely not as good as the Fx3. The A7 IV can only do 120 frames per second slow motion in HD, and it can only film 60 frames per second in the cropped 1.5 mode, not full frame. It also has a much worse rolling shutter due to that 33 megapixel sensor, so if you shoot a lot of handheld action, this is not going to work for you. The final negative to the A7 IV is the possibility of overheating. Now, I have filmed 3-hour events with this camera, hour-long interviews and podcasts, and never had any issues with overheating. But I live in an area with a moderate climate. I also often run a dummy battery into the camera and power it with a V-mount, which probably helps mitigate overheating. If you live somewhere warmer, then this may become a problem for you, which the Fx3 with its built-in fan won't have. But overall, I feel the A7 IV is a much more reasonably priced camera, which provides as good a quality image and a lot of extra features, making this often my Sony go-to camera. Next, we have the Panasonic S5, which has in fact been updated now with the S5 Mark II and the S5 Mark II X. I used the original S5 to film a vlog series on my travels to Amsterdam last year, and I must say I loved using it. It has the best in-camera body stabilization of any camera I've used. It's good in low light, and the Panasonic Vlog is very easy to color grade. It's also very small and compact, which makes it great for vlogging. Also, Panasonic sell a lot of great L-mount lenses, much cheaper than Sony or Canon lenses in RF or E-mount. The reason I ultimately decided to part ways with this camera was its autofocus, which in the original S5 was pretty average. Ultimately, this led me to switching to Sony for quick shooting purposes. Now with the S5 Mark II, it seems they've finally fixed the autofocus issue, and so the Panasonic S5 II offers a great and cheaper alternative to Sony cameras. I mean, Panasonic really designed the S5 IIX in particular with video users in mind, with things like open gate modes and anamorphic settings, plus shutter angle and much more. It is much more of a cinema camera than the Fx3 is, ironically, and I also prefer the Panasonic colors to Sony's when converting from Vlog. The codec seems to have a lot more latitude for grading than S-Log3, and you can film ProRes internally and RAW externally. The battery life for these cameras are excellent, and there's not a lot to dislike. While the autofocus is still not on Canon or Sony level, if you want a DSLR style body camera and you want great IBIS for handheld work, and you want to spend less money than you would have to on either a Canon or Sony, the Panasonic line offers a great cheap alternative with only a couple of compromises. The S5 IIX is my favorite hybrid mirrorless camera to film on. Now we're moving into the two most expensive cameras on the list, and cameras that definitely are more deserving of the cinema name. Let's start with the Canon C70. Now, there is no doubt the C70 offers a lot of great features, and the fact that you can now record Canon RAW on this camera, or XFAVC or MP4 at multiple different bit rates, means it's one of the most flexible cameras on the market in terms of your image control. It also has internal ND filters, and these are so handy to use, and it must be said they are much higher quality than the ND filters put in the Pocket 6K Pro, for instance, with much less color shift. The C70 can also shoot in C-Log2 and C-Log3 with a DGO sensor, which allows for great dynamic range. It's got those nice Canon colors, and it's built very well with the exception of that flip-out LCD screen, which is prone to loosening over time. I thought that this was my dream camera, but after several months of use, found myself a little underwhelmed. Now, if you're choosing between this and the Fx3, I would absolutely choose this. I mean, I think it does a better job with colors and skin tones, offers more dynamic range, and has a soft, pleasing look which is much less digital than the Sony Fx3. However, when comparing it to the 6K full frame and the Ursa 12K, I found that overall the image was just a little bit lacking. The colors could feel a little bit washed out, and I felt that particularly it didn't deal very well with darker skin tones. The slow motion at 120 frames per second was good, but did seem to noticeably drop in quality compared to lower frame rates. The XFAVC and MP4 formats were also the most difficult for my computer to edit on, and this made working on edits slower and more laggy. I also found that while the new Canon RAW provided a slight bump in quality from the regular codecs, I felt it wasn't nearly as good as the Canon RAW Lite that you could film with on the Canon C200, which seemed to be a higher quality version of the raw light codec. Fitting RAW onto SD cards on the C70 has led to a reduction in quality, at least that's what it seems to me. The autofocus was also considerably worse than the Sony cameras, and of course it doesn't provide the same low light shooting quality that the Fx3 does, even with the DGO sensor. I mean, overall this is a great camera, but I just found that it didn't provide me the premium image quality I expected when paying premium Canon prices. As a documentary camera or a camera for corporate work, the C70 ticks the most boxes, but there are other cheaper cameras that I think deliver a better cinematic image, and the shape of this camera when rigged out is really awkward too. And before I'd even completed this review, Canon recently released their C80, which is their upgraded version of the C70, which I got to do some extensive testing with. So is it that much better? Well, the most important upgrade is the new full-frame sensor. This is not a Super 35 camera anymore. Canon have also swapped their 4K DGO sensor in the C70 for a new 6K triple base ISO back illuminated sensor in the C80. Essentially what this triple base ISO sensor really means is that the C80 is pretty much as good as the Sony cameras in low light. This is also a 6K sensor instead of the C70's 4K sensor, so you're getting a crispier, cleaner, downsampled image, which could be better depending on your perspective, and we'll talk about that later. The second major update is a 12G SDI port on its side, so now you have a professional option for running a camera feed out of the camera. It's got a new Ethernet port for streaming. The rest of the camera is pretty similar to the C70. But those new features are a hell of an upgrade. First, the C70's full frame is the best thing about it. So for me, this upgrade alone makes updating worth it. I had the speed booster paired with the C70, but unfortunately, it's just not the same and does introduce several problems like having to use EF glass, autofocus issues, lens compatibility issues, strange flaring and vignetting, and these sort of things make this workaround not the same as a true full frame sensor like on the C80. The C80 also has this 6K sensor, which is definitely sharper than the C70's 4K sensor. You can also shoot in crop mode, which is like having a Super 35 camera along with your full frame camera. You've got a C70 built into the C80. Then you have the triple base ISO. Now, testing this at the highest base ISO of 12,800 shows just how close it gets to Sony cameras. So now you have a 6K full frame with extreme low light and SDI out. I mean, what's not to like? I think there is a question around the new sensor and the sacrifices made to get the additional low light improvements, and therefore some of the dynamic range has been sacrificed in favor of that low light performance. Secondly, the C70 is quite famous for its soft, pleasing look. And the C80 does not have the same soft look, and that is a shame. So for some people, they may prefer that soft C70 look to the new ultra-sharp 6K image. That would be the one reason to stick to the C70. Whereas for anything else, the C80 shows a lot of improvements. In my full review, there's a lot more to say, but as with the C70, the C80's biggest problem for me is its weird shape that makes it so hard to rig out when required. Then there's the Fx6, just quietly sitting in the corner in his rocking chair, still being a similar price point to the C80. What does old man Fx6 make of all these young whippersnappers coming to take the throne? For me, the Fx6 is the most flexible docu-style cinema camera, much like the Fx3 is the most flexible DSLR video camera currently available. While the Fx6 might be old, it was so good when it came out that it still kind of feels new. You get the electronic internal NDs, a much more practical cinema-style body than the C80, and it's also one of the most requested cameras by clients for video work, at least here in New Zealand. This camera is very light, it doesn't take much to build it out, and it has all the amazing Sony features like the best autofocus, the best low light performance. But it's missing some really helpful features that its little brothers, the Fx3 and A7S3, have, such as multiple 10-bit codecs and in-body stabilization. I mean, let's be real, the Fx6 has the same sensor as those cameras. So is the image quality really improved and really worth the extra money? Well, I'll be doing a full video on this, but I think if you need internal NDs or things like SDI out and timecode, then yes. If you want the corporate camera that is the current industry standard, then yes. But if you don't require those features, I don't think so. Looking at the footage side by side, while I do think there's a difference, there's not a huge difference, and there is a huge difference in cost. If I'm not going with the A7 IV, then I might go with the A7S3, which is essentially a cheaper Fx3, which is, as mentioned, not too far off an Fx6 in terms of its image quality. Now, finally, we come to the Red Komodo, which is actually my second Red camera after reviewing the original Red one. The Komodo is sort of known as the first affordable Red camera because it was designed to not really be an A camera, but a crash cam to pair with other, bigger, better Red cameras. But the appeal of shooting on Red and its tiny box form factor means it was a gateway drug for many filmmakers who were wanting to film on Red but couldn't afford to film on Red. It's also the first Red camera to not require proprietary Red memory cards and monitors to get it working properly, and you have to assume that a lot of the reason for this is the pressure other camera companies like Blackmagic and Sony were putting on Red when delivering much more affordable cameras that provided an almost comparable image. So I think that the Red Komodo is great. Yes, you can use it as your A camera. Yes, it pairs well with other Red cameras. It has very good dynamic range. And the big selling point of this camera is Red Code RAW, which is definitely still the best RAW format codec. It shoots in 6K, it has a global shutter, which means it is the best camera for shooting action. And its compact size means you can customize it to the shooting scenario you want. But it's not without its downsides. Firstly, you need to consider that unlike the Sony Fx3, it is a true cinema camera. That means, like any cinema camera, you will need to put in some work to get a good image out of it. It's not a point-and-shoot camera like you can with Sony. To really get the Red Komodo footage to sing, you're going to have to light your scenes well. And of all the cameras, if you don't light your scenes, the Komodo's image will fall apart the quickest. It is not good in low light. This is not a low light camera. And if you like filming in that style, this camera will not work well for you. The 16-bit Red Code RAW means huge amounts of data. You will fill up hard drives quickly, even shooting in LQ or ELQ modes. And to get the most out of the camera, filming in MQ or HQ is required to really make the most of the image. So you will also want to black shade this camera frequently. It takes time to boot up. It takes time to format cards, and of all the cameras we've talked about, it has the most limited slow motion options unless you crop in on your sensor, which just means you're reducing the quality significantly for those higher frame rates. It's also an expensive camera to get working. You know, I've talked about rigging it affordably, but by the time you've got a monitor, cage, battery solution, and memory cards, you will have spent at least another couple of $1,000s. So how much better is the image than a Blackmagic 6K, which is probably the most comparable camera on this list? The truth is, the image is noticeably better. If you know how to light your scenes, Red Code RAW is considerably better than B-RAW, and I noticed that uptick in quality immediately. But it's easier to get a nice image with less work with the Blackmagic 6K. It's much better in low light. It does better slow motion frame rates, and most importantly, it's less than half the price. And while the Komodo image is better, it's not over twice as good. It's also important to note that the internal audio recording on the Komodo is very poor quality compared to most of the other cameras on this list. It has no XLR inputs for professional work, and you will need a separate audio recorder when using this camera, which is not the case for the Pocket 6K, C70 Fx3 or Ursa cameras. So that is definitely a drawback and the reason that I filmed less with the Komodo than I otherwise might. There's also the unfortunate SDI issue with the Komodo, which makes blowing the SDI connector too easy to do unless you follow a rather backwards protocol when plugging and unplugging your monitor. The Komodo is an excellent camera and a good introduction to RED cameras. It's definitely a tier down from their new RED Raptor cameras, and most would argue not on par with a lot of their old DMS-C2 lineup like the RED Gemini and Dragon. But it is still capable of delivering some beautiful images, and of all the cameras on the list, I would only say the Ursa 12K could match its quality. And finally, there is the Komodo X. Is it worth skipping the Komodo and going straight to X? I think for most people, if you're paying a new price for a Komodo, then yes, the Komodo X seems to offer some great upgrades, improvements in low light, better slow motion frame rates, better audio options, improved color science on skin tones, more dynamic range. These are all great improvements. However, everyone who bought a Komodo is now trying to sell their Komodo so they can buy a Komodo X. That means that we're seeing fully kitted out Komodos going for just over $4,000. And if you can buy a fully specced out Komodo with accessories for that price, or buy a new Komodo X for $10,000 for the body only at a price difference of $6,000, you're much better off saving all that money and trying the Komodo and its workflow before committing to the much larger, more expense of the Komodo X. So which camera is right for you? Well, if you want the camera that can do everything, corporate, doco, and narrative film with the least amount of effort, the Sony Fx3 or A7 IV is probably the best option. If you're an aspiring filmmaker who wants to create cinematic looks with a modest budget, the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro or the Full Frame Cinema 6K or Pyxis will provide you the nicest image for the price tag. If you want a more affordable mirrorless style hybrid camera than the Sony that's full of feature-rich video modes and cinema camera features, the Panasonic S5 Mark II X offers great value for money. If you want to do documentary work or higher level commercial and corporate work, I would choose the new C80. Well, I would have chosen the C80 if not for its terrible body design. So actually, I would get the Fx6 here. If you're a serious filmmaker who wants to take their work visually to the next level and provide high-end cinema looks, then the Ursa 12K or RED Komodo or Komodo X will give you the most image quality if you're willing to work for it. Komodo for portability, Ursa 12K for flexibility and slow motion. Remember, there is no best camera. There is only the best camera for you, based off your needs. But if you had to twist my arm and I had to pick just one of these cameras, taking into account the cost and the image quality and everything else, I'd still have to pick the Blackmagic Cinema Camera 6K full frame. The price to performance ratio of this camera is just insane. And I keep going back to this camera because it does so many things so well. But remember, I'm not a YouTuber. I'm a filmmaker who YouTubes. So I am chasing the film look, and that's what the 6K delivers. It all depends on what you want from your image. I hope you found this camera breakdown helpful. I'd love to know what your favorite camera is and why in the comments. I'd love to hear you disagree with me with your best rude and snarky comment undermining all my hard work in the comments. I'd particularly love to see a comment from you if you barely watched any of this video, skipped key information, formed your own opinion based on this lack of information, and wanted to comment. We love comments here. That's what I'm saying. And if you want to see my full review of many of these cameras, check them out beside me or listed in the description. As always, I am the Savage Filmmaker, and I'll see you when I see you.